Hey guys, before tonight's journey begins, take a moment to settle in. Find the position your body wants to rest in. Loosen anything that feels tight. Let your shoulders drop, and let the day you have carried begin to set itself down. Tonight we are spending a long, quiet evening in a small harbour town, sitting among old sea captains on a weathered wharf, listening to the stories they have carried home from a lifetime at sea. There is nothing here you need to follow closely. The story moves at the pace of breathing, and it is meant to carry you gently towards sleep. If these quiet journeys help you rest, you are warmly welcome to follow the channel, so that another evening like this, one can find you when you need it. A quiet like, or a few words left below about where you are listening from tonight, helps others discover these stories too. There is no hurry to do any of it. It can wait until morning, or it can wait forever. None of it asks anything of you now. For now, there is only this, the warmth around you, the slow settling of the night, a long, gentle story waiting to begin. So let your eyes close if they wish to. Let your breathing slow, and when you are ready we will step out onto a wooden wharf, where the smell of salt and old rope hangs in the still air. There is a town on the New England coast that most people have forgotten. It sits where the land turns quiet and gives itself over to the sea, tucked behind a harbour that was deep and busy once, though a sandbar has been filling in for years now, and the big ships don't come anymore. The warehouses along the shore stand half empty, their doors swollen shut with salt damp. A small brig is going slowly to pieces beside one of the wharves, and all along the waterline you can see old dories and whale boats that have been left where they last touched land, tilting on their sides in the grass waiting for no one. But the town is not quite abandoned, and the wharves are not quite silent. On any fair morning, if you walk down to the harbour, you'll find them there. Old men, 5 or 6 of them, sometimes more, sitting close together on the sun-warmed planks of the wharf. They sit close because so many of them are deaf, and they have little black pipes with short stems, and they smoke steadily and watch the water as if they are still expecting something to come in on the tide. Their hands and faces are the colour of old leather, deep folded rather than wrinkled, browned by decades of wind and salt spray. Their eyes are pale blue, very keen, and their hair has gone thin and fine, like the seaweed that clings to mussel shells along the rocks. They look, all of them, as if they might have sailed with the Northmen 1,000 years ago and simply never quite come ashore. They were captains once, every one. They carried cargo to Bristol and Havana, to Cadiz and Calcutta and ports whose names we've half forgotten. They knew the smell of the trades and the weight of a nor'easter before it arrived, and now they sit here, in this little harbour where the grass grows between the wharf planks, and they talk. They talk about what the Sea Duck carried out in 1812, and how many tons the old brig Havana could hold, and whether it was the Dorado or the Dorado sister ship that went down off Blue Point in the Great Storm. They argue about it with the seriousness of men who have nothing left to prove and everything left to remember. I want to spend some time among them tonight. I want to sit just close enough to hear their voices, low and unhurried, drifting in and out with the sound of the water against the pilings. There's a captain who keeps a warehouse full of things he brought home from every voyage he ever made, and he'll open the door for us if we ask gently. There's another one who lives on a farm now, 2 miles inland, but who can't stop talking about the sea. There's a fisherman down by the fish houses who doesn't say much about himself at all, though once, if you wait long enough, he'll tell you about a cat. None of their stories are grand. None of them build toward anything you need to brace yourself for. They are just the things old men remember when the afternoon is long, and the harbour is still, told in voices that have grown softer with the years. And there is something in the listening, I think, that feels like resting. Like settling into a chair that has held someone before you, in a room that smells of salt and wood smoke and time. The tide is coming in now, the light is warm on the old planks, and if we walk a little farther down the harbour, we'll find the place where the captains are sitting. You can tell what Brimbury used to be by the size of its houses. They stand along the main street with a kind of faded authority, wide and square, built from timber that was already old 100 years ago. Some of them have widows' walks on top, those little railed platforms where a captain's wife could stand and look out past the harbour toward the open sea, watching for a sail she knew by heart. Most of those railings are soft with rot now, and nobody climbs up there anymore, but they're still there, tilted slightly against the sky, like hands shading their eyes. The front doors are broad enough to bring a sea chest through without turning it sideways, and inside, if you were ever invited in, you'd find rooms panelled in dark wood and furnished with things that came off ships. A carved table from Calcutta, a set of Canton china, a clock from Liverpool that hasn't kept the right time in 20 years but still ticks on, stubborn and faithful, in a hallway that smells of cedar and sea damp. The gardens have gone wild in places. You can see where box hedges were once trimmed into careful shapes and where the paths were laid out straight, but the lilacs have grown enormous, and the roses have climbed over everything, and the grass has crept across the flagstones until you can barely tell where the path used to go. It isn't neglect exactly. It's more like the town has slowly exhaled and let its edges soften. There's a kind of gentleness in it, if you look at it the right way. A place that isn't trying to be anything anymore, and is simply being what it is. Walk farther from the main street, toward the water, and you'll pass the old counting houses where the shipping firms used to keep their books, the ledger rooms where men once tallied hogsheads of sugar and bales of cotton and barrels of rum from the West Indies. Their windows are dark now. Farther still, a long low building that was the sail loft, where canvas was spread and measured and sewn by men who could put a seam as straight as a surveyor's line. Its floor is still dusted with the fine grit of wax and twine, and beyond that you reach the harbour, and the softening is more honest there. You can see the bones of the place. The wharves stretch out into the water on blackened pilings crusted with barnacles, and draped with rockweed that lifts and falls with each slow wave. Between the planks, thin grass grows where the caulking used to be. An old brig sits at permanent rest against the longest wharf. Her paint gone, her deck timbers sprung, her rigging long since taken for other uses. Beside her, a few dories lie tilted on the mud flats, and beyond them, in the shallows, a schooner's hull has settled into the harbour floor as naturally as if it were a rock that had always been there. The smell of the place is its own kind of welcome. Salt and tar and old wood baking in the sun, and underneath it something cooler. Something like mud and iron and the faint green sweetness of rockweed drying on the pilings. If the wind comes off the water, you get the clean mineral breath of the open sea. If it comes off the land, you get the fish houses, a thick, honest, working smell of brine and cod and the damp barrels where they pack the catch. It isn't unpleasant, once you've been here a few days. It becomes the smell of the town itself, the smell of a place that has lived by the sea for so long that the sea is soaked into everything, into the shingles and the rope coils and the very grain of the wharf planks under your feet. These aren't wrecks the way you might imagine them. Nobody went down in a storm. They were simply left behind one by one as the harbour silted up and the trade moved on to deeper ports, and the men who sailed them grew too old to haul canvas and came ashore for the last time. I keep thinking about that, what it means to be left behind not by disaster, but by time. Nobody decided Brimbry was finished. The sea just rearranged the sand a little, season by season, and the channel got shallower, and one year the big merchantmen stopped trying to come in, and the next year fewer still. Until one morning the harbour was quiet, and it had been quiet for so long that nobody could remember exactly when the last real cargo ship had tied up at the wharf. That's how towns like this go. Not all at once, just gently, the way a fire burns down. But the men are still here, and that's what matters tonight. If you walk down the hill past the old customs house and turn toward the water, you'll find them most mornings on the south-facing wharf, the one that catches the sun earliest and holds it longest. They've been gathering here for years, decades really, and each man has his spot on the planks the way a churchgoer has his pew. They don't announce themselves. They just appear, one by one, as the morning warms up, lowering themselves carefully onto the sun-bleached wood with the stiff caution of men whose joints have taken a lot of weather. Someone produces a tobacco pouch. Someone else already has his pipe going, a thin curl of smoke rising straight up in the still air. And then they sit, and they watch the water, and sooner or later someone says something about a ship. That's how it always starts, a ship. Not a feeling, not a worry, not the kind of thing you and I might talk about on a quiet morning. A ship. Her name, her tonnage, the year she was launched, the colour of her hull. And then someone else says no. That wasn't the year, it was the year after, and the tonnage was closer to 400, and anyway it wasn't the hull that was green, it was the boot top stripe, and then they're off. They'll argue about it with tremendous care and perfect seriousness, leaning in close because most of them can't hear very well anymore, raising their voices without realising it, tapping their pipe stems against the planks for emphasis. They aren't angry. They aren't even really disagreeing. They're just tending something, keeping it alive the way you'd keep a fire going in a hearth, not because you need the warmth, but because a fire that goes out is hard to start again. If a stranger comes down to the wharf, the talk stops, not rudely. Nobody tells you to leave, nobody glares. They just go quiet the way a flock of birds goes quiet when a shadow passes over. They'll nod, they'll say good morning. But the stories won't come back until the stranger has either gone away or sat there long enough, often enough, to stop being a stranger. There's no test for this, no particular number of visits. You simply feel, one morning, that the pause after you arrive is a little shorter, and then shorter still, and then one day someone picks up a story in the middle without glancing your way first, and you know you've been let in. It takes patience. But everything in Brimbury takes patience. The town itself is patient, slow, unhurried, and the men who belong to it don't move any faster than it does. There's something I find quietly remarkable about the way these men carry their knowledge. They don't have logbooks in front of them. They don't consult anything. It's all in their heads. The name of every ship they ever sailed, and the names of the ships their fathers sailed, and the cargoes and the routes and the weather on particular crossings 40 or 50 years ago. They can tell you what Captain so-and-so loaded at Calcutta in 1839, and how many barrels of molasses the old Dorado could hold before she sat too deep in the water, and which pier in Bristol was best for unloading linen and which one the harbour master reserved for the coal trade. They remember the precise shade of a sunset off the Bermudas on a particular Tuesday in a particular year, and how the flying fish looked coming over the bow at dawn, and which tavern in Singapore served the best coffee, and what the dock boys in Havana would try to charge you for carrying your sea chest. These are not important facts by any measure the world would use, but they're exact, and they're held with care, and in the mouths of these old men they become something more than information. They become the proof that a life was lived, and that it mattered to the one who lived it. It's an entire world stored in the minds of 6 or 7 old men on a wharf, and when they're gone, it goes with them. Nobody's writing it down. Nobody thinks to. And maybe that's all right. Maybe some things are meant to live only as long as the voices that carry them. The town itself still moves to the rhythm of the sea, even now. You can feel it in the way people talk. Everything is measured in cables' lengths and fathoms, not yards and feet. A man's reputation is still reckoned partly by whether he ever went to sea, and the families who sent 3 generations of captains out of this harbour carry a quiet authority that no amount of money from any other trade could quite match. The old widows in their parlours can name every ship their husbands commanded, and the routes, and the years, and they keep painted portraits of the vessels on their walls alongside the portraits of the men who sailed them, as if the ships were members of the family too. Down at the harbour you'll see figureheads propped against warehouse walls, a carved woman with her eyes to the horizon, a painted eagle with one wing broken, and no one thinks to move them. They stand there the way gravestones stand in a churchyard, quietly marking something that is over. Even the children here grow up knowing port from starboard, and they play on the wharves and in the beach dories as if the harbour were a kind of schoolyard, learning the names of knots and the parts of a sail the way children elsewhere learn the names of flowers. The sea runs through this town like a thread through cloth. Pull it out, and the whole weave would come apart. And then there is the matter of Captain Oliver Aldridge, who has been gone for several years now, but who remains, in the quiet way of small towns, the most important man in Brimbury. He was a bachelor. He lived in a large house near the harbour with a housekeeper and a great many cats, and he was, by all accounts, extraordinarily generous. He gave free suppers, he hosted whist parties that ran late into the night, the cards dealt on a table brought home from a voyage to the Dutch East Indies, the candles burning down to stubs while the old men played hand after hand in a fog of pipe smoke. He lent money without mentioning it again, and when a young man needed outfitting for his first voyage, Captain Aldridge would appear at the chandler's and settle the account with the quiet ease of a man paying his own grocer's bill. He kept a standing order at the bakery for an extra loaf on Saturdays, which he'd leave at the back door of whichever household he knew was having a thin week. He wasn't showy about it. That wasn't his way. He simply believed that a man who had done well at sea owed something to the town that had sent him out, and he paid that debt steadily year after year until the night he sat down in his chair after supper and didn't get up again. You know what stays with me about Captain Aldridge? It's that he never married and he never seemed lonely. He had the town, he had the harbour, he had the old captains coming to his door for tobacco and argument, and the younger men coming for advice, and the widows sending over pies and the children running through his garden. He'd built himself a life out of the ordinary kindnesses of a small place, and it held him as surely as any family would have. I don't think we always notice when someone has done that. We notice the marriages and the children and the milestones, but a man who simply makes himself useful to everyone around him, quietly, for 40 years, that's its own kind of a life, and it has its own kind of fullness, and Captain Aldridge seems to have understood that without anyone needing to tell him. His house stands empty now. The housekeeper moved to her sister's place inland, and the cats dispersed to various fish houses and barns around the harbour. But the captains on the wharf still speak of him in present tense sometimes, the way you do when someone has been so thoroughly part of a place that their absence hasn't quite registered yet. Aldridge says, one of them will begin, and then catch himself and go quiet for a moment and relight his pipe. On Sundays, you can hear the old sailors in church. They sit together near the back, these same weathered men, in coats that are too tight across the shoulders and collars that have gone soft at the fold. And when the hymns begin, they sing. They sing the way they must have sung on deck in a gale, with enormous unrestrained force, their voices rough and huge and completely indifferent to the tune. It isn't beautiful, not in any way that a music teacher would recognise, but it fills the building. It fills it the way a storm fills a harbour, pushing into every corner, rattling the windows, making the candle flames lean sideways. The younger people in the congregation glance at each other and try not to smile, and the minister keeps his eyes on his hymnal, and the old men sing on, oblivious, pouring everything they have into the sound as if volume were a form of devotion, and the louder you sang, the closer God could hear you. And I think there's something honest in it, something worth sitting with for a moment. These are men who spent their whole lives in loud places, on ships in heavy weather, in ports where the loading never stopped, in harbours where the wind came off the water with a weight you could lean into. Quietness doesn't come naturally to them. Gentleness doesn't come naturally to them. And yet here they are, in the last years of their lives, sitting on a wharf in a town that has gone soft and still around them, and they've made their peace with it. They haven't become gentle themselves, exactly, but they've found a place where their roughness fits, where nobody minds if they shout their hymns or argue about tonnage or bang their pipes on the planks. They belong to Brimbury the way the old hulks belong to the harbour, not because anyone planned it, but because they've been here so long that the place has shaped itself around them. The afternoon light moves slowly across the wharf. A gull settles on the brig's bowsprit and sits there, motionless, looking out at the harbour with the same patient stillness as the men below. The air cools by a single degree, and you can feel the day beginning to turn, the warmth pulling back from the planks like a tide going out. The shadows of the pilings stretch longer on the water, and the harbour takes on that late afternoon colour, somewhere between gold and grey, that makes everything look both very near and very far away at once. One by one, the captains knock out their pipes and get to their feet, steadying themselves on each other's arms, and begin the slow walk up the hill toward home. They don't say goodbye. They don't need to. They'll be here again tomorrow in the same spots, with the same tobacco and the same arguments, and the same pale eyes watching the tide. The wharf goes quiet. The water laps at the pilings, and somewhere in the fish houses at the far end of the harbour, a door creaks on its hinge and a cat slips out into the last of the sun. Captain Reginald Hale is the oldest of them all, and when he speaks, the others listen. Not because he demands it. He doesn't ask for anything, and wouldn't know how. It's more that his voice has a particular quality, a low, steady drone that seems to come from somewhere deeper than his chest, somewhere down in the keel of him, and it carries across the wharf the way a foghorn carries across water. You hear it before you're quite aware you're listening. It settles into the air the way pipe smoke settles into wool, and once it's there, it doesn't leave. The other captains lean in when he talks. They tilt their good ears toward him, and their pipes go still, and even the ones who are in the middle of their own stories let the thread drop and wait, because Captain Hale has been to more ports, and survived more weather, and outlived more shipmates than any man on this wharf. And when he opens a story, it's understood that the story will be worth the hearing. He's a tall man, or was, His back has taken on the permanent stoop of a mainmast that's carried too much canvas for too many years. His hands are enormous, broad across the knuckle, the fingers bent sideways from old brakes that set wrong at sea where there was no surgeon to set them right. They look like hands that have hauled rope in every kind of weather. His face is all verticals, long nose, long jaw, deep lines running from cheekbone to chin like the grain in weathered oak. And his eyes, beneath brows that have gone white and wild as spray, are the palest blue you've ever seen. So pale they look almost silver in certain light, as if the years of staring at open water had washed the colour out of them. He wears the same coat every day, a heavy broadcloth that was probably very fine once, but has gone soft at the seams and shiny at the elbows, and he buttons it all the way up no matter how warm the morning, because that is how a captain dresses, and he is not about to change his habits now. He has never needed to explain himself. The coat says it for him. I find myself watching him sometimes before he starts talking, in those moments when he's just sitting. His hands rest on his knees and his pipe hangs from his lower lip, and he looks out at the harbour with an expression that isn't wistful, exactly, and isn't sad, but is simply very far away, as if the water he's looking at isn't this quiet, silted harbour, but some other water, in some other decade, under a different sky. And then someone says something that catches his attention, a name, a date, a ship, and the distance snaps shut and he's here again, leaning forward with a sharp look, ready to correct the record. He was, by his own admission, a man of terrible temper in his younger days. He says it plainly, without pride and without apology, the way you'd say that the wind blew hard on a particular crossing. Just a fact, just the weather of his nature. He was big, twice the size of most of the men he dealt with in foreign ports, and he was not the sort to let a thing go. If a merchant cheated him, the merchant heard about it. If a dock agent tried to short his cargo, the dock agent regretted it. He didn't boast about this. He told it the way you'd tell someone about a chronic ailment, something he lived with, something that caused him trouble, something that was simply part of the machinery of being Reginald Hale. And the Bristol cloth story, that's his masterpiece, the one the others never tire of hearing, the one that draws the approving murmur from the group like a congregation responding to a line they know by heart. It goes like this. Years ago, many years, when he was still young enough to be dangerous, Captain Hale put in at Bristol with a full hold and a list of goods to bring back. Bristol in those days was a forest of masts and rigging, the quays so crowded with cargo that you could walk from one end of the harbour to the other on bales and barrels without once touching the ground. The air smelled of tar and hemp, and the sharp mineral tang of coal dust, and the noise was constant. Longshoremen shouting, chains rattling through blocks, the groan of timber as ships settled against the pilings. It was the kind of port where 100 transactions happened every hour, where money changed hands so quickly that the temptation to cut corners was built into the pace of the place itself. Among the things he'd ordered was a quantity of cloth, good English broadcloth, paid for in advance, and meant for a merchant back in New England who had particular standards about what he'd sell over his counter. The cloth was supposed to be delivered to the ship before they sailed, and it arrived just barely in time, carried down to the quay by the shopkeeper's boy in a handcart just as the crew was making ready to weigh anchor. The tide was right. The wind was coming around. There was no time to waste, and the shopkeeper knew it. But Captain Hale, and here's the thing about him, the thing that made him what he was. Captain Hale looked at the cloth. He didn't have to. It was wrapped and tied and addressed. Any other captain would have stowed it in the hold and thought no more about it until they raised the New England coast. But something nagged at him. Some instinct bred into him the way a dog's nose is bred for finding what's hidden, told him to unwrap the parcel and take a look. So he did. And it wasn't the cloth he'd ordered, not even close. He knew it the moment he saw it. The broadcloth was gone, replaced by something coarse and cheap and wholly wrong. A rough, ugly stuff that you could see the light through if you held it up, loosely woven and full of knots, the kind of thing you wouldn't put on a barn floor, let alone sell over a counter. The shopkeeper had waited until the very last moment, banked on the tide and the captain's hurry, and made the switch. It was brazen. It was calculated. You know what I keep coming back to about this? It's the confidence of the cheat. That Bristol merchant looked at Captain Hale, a man who could have picked him up by the collar with one hand, and calculated that the sea would do the work of deception for him. That a captain in a hurry to catch the tide wouldn't stop to unwrap a package. It was a small, clever, cowardly kind of swindle. the kind that depends entirely on the other person not paying attention. And it must have worked before, with other captains, other ships, other parcels quietly swapped at the last moment on the quay. But it didn't work this time. Captain Hale had the gig manned. They were already out in the stream, sails loose, the anchor coming up, the whole ship ready to move. He didn't hesitate. He climbed down into the small boat with his men, and they rowed back to shore through the harbour traffic and the turning tide. And he walked into that shopkeeper's premises with the parcel under his arm, and the look on his face that his crew knew well enough to stand back from. The way he tells it, and he tells it slowly, savouring it, his voice dropping into that deep drone. The shopkeeper went the colour of a boiled lobster the moment he walked through the door. The man knew. Of course he knew. He tried to grin, tried to pretend it was a mix-up, tried the old line about supposing the captain was already standing out to sea by now. And Captain Hale, the Hale of 50 years ago, the one who stood 6'3" and hadn't yet learned to let small things pass, told the man that if the correct cloth wasn't on the quay and loaded into the gig within a quarter of an hour, he'd take him by the scruff and drop him into the dock. The cloth arrived in 12 minutes, and the punchline, the part that always gets the low rumble of appreciation from the wharf, is how he described the swapped goods. Spun from dog's hair and the devil's own wool, he said, kicked together by spiders, coarser than anything you'd use to cover a horse, with threads so far apart you could fit your whole arm through the weave. It isn't true, of course, not literally, but it's the way Captain Hale talks when he's angry, even in memory. He builds his contempt into something physical, something you can see and feel, and the exaggeration is part of the pleasure of the telling. The other captains love it. They've heard it dozens of times. They know every beat, every pause, every inflection, and they sit there on the warm planks and listen to it the way you'd listen to a piece of music you've known since childhood, finding comfort not in surprise, but in the perfect familiarity of the thing. He has other stories too, though none that he tells with quite the same relish. He can recount every port he ever entered, and the order he entered them, and what the sky looked like when he raised the harbour light. He'll tell you how many days it took to cross from Brimbury to Liverpool in the winter of '41, and how the ice built up on the rigging until the ship creaked under the weight of it, and how his second mate climbed the shrouds every 4 hours to knock the worst of it free with a wooden mallet. He'll tell you about the strange birds that followed the ship through the tropics, and the whales that blew so close to the hull you could smell their breath, and the night he saw a light burning on the water where no ship should have been, a steady yellow glow that moved against the current and then winked out and was never explained. But these stories he tells casually, almost as afterthoughts, tossed out between draws on his pipe. The Bristol cloth, that's the one he saves. That's the one that proves what he needs it to prove, which is simply this, that he was not a man to be cheated, and that the sea did not make him careless, and that even at the very edge of the tide, with his ship straining at her anchor, he stopped and looked and found what was wrong. It's not really a story about cloth at all. It's a story about attention, and the kind of pride that refuses to let the small things slide. There are rules on this wharf, though nobody would call them that. They aren't written anywhere, and they aren't spoken, and if you asked any of these men whether the wharf had rules, he'd look at you as if you'd asked whether the tide had manners. But they're there, and they're observed as strictly as any protocol on a quarterdeck. The first rule is about strangers. If someone unfamiliar walks down to the wharf, a summer visitor say, or a peddler from out of town, the conversation stops. It doesn't stop abruptly, the way a guilty conversation stops when someone walks in. It stops gently, like a song fading. One captain finishes his sentence and no one begins the next one, and a sort of comfortable blankness settles over the group, and they all gaze out at the water with tremendous interest, as though they had been sitting there in silence all along and couldn't imagine what you might have expected them to be doing. They're polite about it. They'll nod. They might remark upon the weather. But the stories stay locked behind those pale, amused eyes until the stranger moves on. It isn't unfriendliness. It's something more like privacy. The kind of privacy that belongs to any group of people who have known each other for longer than most marriages last, and who share a vocabulary of names and places and events that no outsider could follow anyway. Their stories aren't told for entertainment. They're told for the tending of shared memory. And shared memory, by definition, requires a shared past. And then there's the matter of rank. Though rank isn't quite the word for it either. Not every old man on the wharf was a captain in the strict sense. Some held the title honestly, earned it on a quarterdeck with a crew under their command and a ship's log with their name at the top of every entry. Others came by it more gently, arrived at a certain age, in a town where seafaring was the only trade that counted, and found that people had simply begun calling them captain the way you'd call any elder by a title of respect. Perhaps they'd been mates, or boatswains, or ordinary hands who made a dozen voyages without ever rising above the forecastle. It didn't matter. They'd gone to sea, they'd come back. They had salt in their blood and stories in their heads and the right kind of weathering on their faces, and Brimbury granted them the title like a pension, something earned by showing up year after year and surviving. It was a kind of quiet promotion that the town bestowed on its old men, a way of saying, you belong to the sea, whether or not the sea ever gave you a command. Nobody questioned it. Nobody pointed out the difference. On the wharf, all captains were equal, and the title was worn as comfortably as an old coat. Captain Hale knows every one of these unspoken arrangements, and he keeps them without thinking about it, the way he keeps time by the tide without consulting a clock. He knows when it's his turn to talk and when it's someone else's. He knows which stories belong to which man, and he wouldn't dream of telling another captain's best yarn, even if he could tell it better. He knows that the south end of the wharf belongs to the older men, and the north end is for the ones who still go out fishing. He knows that you don't ask a man about a voyage that ended badly, and you don't mention a ship that was lost with hands, and you never, under any circumstances, speak ill of another man's vessel, because a ship is as personal as a wife, and considerably more public. These are small things. They don't matter to anyone outside this wharf. But they're held with a care and a seriousness that I find deeply human, the same seriousness with which people everywhere tend the boundaries of their small familiar worlds, the neighbourhood, the pub, the church pew, the park bench. We all make these little kingdoms for ourselves, these places where we know the customs because we wrote them, and where the rules exist not to keep others out but to keep the thing itself intact. The captain's wharf is one of these kingdoms, and Captain Hale, whether he knows it or not, is its king. He's sitting there now, in the morning sun, with his pipe in his teeth and his silver eyes on the water. The harbour is still. The gulls are quiet. He isn't talking yet. He's waiting for the right moment, the right opening, the right name to surface in someone else's sentence that will give him a reason to begin. He's patient. He's been patient for 80 years in his way. Patient with the sea, patient with the wind, patient with the long crossings and the slow harbours and the cloth merchants of Bristol. And now he's patient with time itself, which has brought him here, to this wharf, to this morning, to this warmth on the old planks where the only thing left to do is remember, and the only thing left to be is what he has always been. A captain, the eldest, the one who saw through the swindle and rowed back to shore. The wharf is warm beneath him, the tide is turning. If you leave the harbour and walk inland along the ridge road, past the last of the salt meadows and up into the fields where the soil turns dark and the air loses its mineral edge, you'll come after about 2 miles to a farmhouse set back from the lane behind a stone wall that's been mended so many times it looks like a geological survey of the neighbourhood. Grey granite beside brown fieldstone beside a chunk of ballast rock that almost certainly came off a ship. The road itself changes as you walk it. Near the harbour it's hard-packed sand and crushed shell, and it smells of brine and fish oil, and you can hear the creak of rigging and the knock of dories against the pilings. But as you climb, the salt fades and the land takes over. Clover and warm grass and the dusty sweetness of hay that's been cut and left to dry in the sun. By the time you reach the farm, the harbour is hidden behind a fold of hill, and you wouldn't know the sea was there at all except for a faint brightness in the sky to the south, where the light bounces off the water and throws itself up into the clouds. The yard is tidy in a restless, over-attended way, as if someone has been sweeping it for lack of anything better to do. There's a wood pile that's been stacked with the precision of a man who once packed cargo holds for a living, every log fitted so tight you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. And on the porch, in a flag-bottomed chair that he's carried out from the woodhouse and positioned to face south, toward the invisible sea, sits Captain Arthur Ashwell. A striped cat is asleep on the railing beside him, and a rooster is picking at something between the paving stones, and the only sounds are the creak of the chair and the slow, distant lowing of a cow in the pasture beyond the barn. It's a peaceful place. It's the kind of place a man might choose to spend his old age if choosing were the word for it. He doesn't look like a farmer. That's the first thing you notice. His hands are a sailor's hands, calloused across the palms, thick in the fingers with that particular rope-burned roughness that no amount of ploughing will ever quite replace. His face has the same deep weathering as the men on the wharf, The same pale, sea-washed eyes, the same look of having spent decades squinting into distances that dry land can't provide. But his body is different from theirs. Where the wharf captains have gone stiff and slow, Ashwell is still quick. He moves with a sharp, darting energy, leaning forward in his chair, cocking his head to one side, gesturing with both hands when he talks. He reminds you, more than anything, of an old sparrow, a small, brown, bright-eyed bird that hops from branch to branch and never quite settles, chirping at everything that passes, full of opinions and observations and an irrepressible need to be heard. He was a captain once, a real one, with a ship under him and a crew and a route that took him from Brimbury to Bristol and around the Cape and down to ports whose names he still pronounces with a proprietary tenderness, as if they were rooms in a house he once lived in. He'd been at sea since he was old enough to climb a ratline, and he'd worked his way up from cabin boy to mate to master, and by the time he was 40 he owned a share in a fine barque called the Dorado, and was known in half the harbours of the Atlantic as a man who kept a clean ship and paid his debts, and could read the weather 3 days out. The sea was his living and his language and the shape of his days, and he never imagined doing anything else. But his wife, and he speaks of her with a complicated mixture of love and exasperation that hasn't dimmed in 20 years. His wife couldn't bear it. She couldn't bear the waiting, the not knowing, the long months of staring out the window at the weather and wondering whether the same wind that was rattling the shutters was doing worse things to a ship in the North Atlantic. She didn't say this in so many words, he tells you. She wasn't the kind to weep or plead. She just went quiet every time he left and was a little quieter when he came back, and the silences got longer and heavier until they had a weight to them that even a man as cheerful as Ashwell couldn't pretend not to notice. And then her brother passed on and left her this farm, and some considerable means besides, and between her and the daughters and the neighbours and the minister, all of them working on him from different angles, like a crew tacking against the wind. They wore him down. He sold his share of the Dorado. He kept a small piece of another vessel, the Dorian, and served as her ship's husband for a few years, managing her affairs from shore, but she was never heard from again after a voyage to Singapore, and that was the end of his connection to any living ship. He moved to the farm. He learned to plough. He learned the names of weeds and the habits of chickens and the particular stubbornness of a fence post that doesn't want to stay straight in rocky ground. And he hated every minute of it. Not hated exactly. That's too strong. He's too good-natured for hatred. But he felt it, the wrongness of it, the way a saltwater fish would feel the wrongness of a freshwater pond. The farm was 2 miles from the harbour, which doesn't sound like much, but for a man who'd spent his whole life within earshot of the tide, it might as well have been 200. He couldn't hear the gulls. He couldn't smell the mudflats at low water. He couldn't walk down to the wharf in the morning and sit with the men who spoke his language and remembered the same ports and the same weather. He was landlocked, and the land didn't fit. When he does come down to the harbour, and he comes as often as he can manage, walking the 2 miles each way with a vigour that puts younger men to shame, the wharf captains welcome him like a ship returning to port. They shift over to make room, they fill him in on the arguments he's missed, and Ashwell talks, fast and bright and without pause, pouring out all the conversation he's been storing up in his farmhouse solitude, the way a dam lets go of water it's been holding too long. He knows every family in Brimbury, and half the families in the towns along the coast, and he can tell you who married whom, and who went to sea and who came back and who didn't, going back 3 or 4 generations without hesitation. He remembers which captain's daughter eloped with the chandler's son, and which widow sold her husband's ship to pay his debts, and which old family's house caught fire on the same night their last surviving son went down with his vessel off the banks. These aren't gossip to him, they're history, the small human history of a place he belongs to, kept alive in his quick, bright voice, because nobody else remembers the details anymore, and because if he doesn't tell them, they'll be gone. I keep thinking about what that must have felt like, that first winter especially. The farm in December, with the fields frozen hard and the trees bare and the sky a flat, grey, featureless thing that offered nothing to read, no sign of what was coming, no hint of wind direction or weather change. A sailor reads the sky the way a scholar reads a page, looking for meaning in every shift of colour and cloud. But a winter sky over a New England farm doesn't move the way an ocean sky moves. It just sits there, heavy and still, and it tells you nothing except that more cold is coming. He must have stood at the window of that farmhouse and looked south toward where the sea was, and felt the distance like a physical thing, like a rope pulled taut across his chest. He once said, almost to himself, that he felt terribly old in winter compared to how he felt in summer. In summer at least there was the fishing. There was the long light and the warm wind off the fields that carried, if you held still and waited, the faintest trace of salt. But in winter there was nothing. Just the frozen ground and the grey sky and the farm chores that repeated themselves day after day, exactly alike, with none of the variety that the sea gives even at its cruelest. At sea, no 2 days are the same. The wind shifts, the current changes, the clouds take a new shape, and every morning is a problem to be read and solved. On a farm in January, every morning is the same problem, and it was solved 100 years ago by the man who first laid the fences. There is no navigation in it. There is nothing to steer, and yet he stayed. That's the part I can't quite let go of. He stayed because she asked him to, and because the daughters were growing up, and because he'd given his word, and because there is a kind of stubbornness in decent men that looks very much like gentleness from the outside, but is in fact a decision to endure something quietly rather than cause pain to someone they love. He never blamed her. Not once, in all the times he's told the story. He just says, with that sparrow's brightness in his voice, that she never could rest easy when he was on a voyage, and that the farm came from her brother, and that they all set to and gave him no peace of mind until he sold out and came ashore. He tells it like weather, something that happened to him, not something anyone did wrong. But he never stopped needing the sea. Every few weeks, he tells you, he has to walk the 2 miles back to the harbour and spend a whole day fishing just to scrape the barnacles off the old hull. He says it with a grin, but you can see that it's not entirely a joke. The fishing trips are maintenance, not for any hull, but for himself, for whatever part of him still runs on salt water and tidal rhythms. He goes down to the harbour and borrows a dory and rows out past the breakwater with a hand line and a bucket of bait, and he sits there for hours, alone on the water, not catching much, not caring, just being near the thing he misses. And then he rows back and ties up and walks up the hill to his farm, and he's good for another few weeks. The barnacles have been scraped, the hull is clean, he can go back to being a farmer until the salt builds up again. What gets to him, though, and here his brightness dims just a shade, and you can see the loneliness underneath it like a rock visible through shallow water, is the way the world has decided he's old. He says it with a sharpness that's almost fierce. He wishes he lived closer to the harbour, where he could see the people he knows and talk about what's been happening. He doesn't like being called Old Captain Ashwell by people who are nearly as old as he is and can't do half the work he can. He doesn't like being patted and humoured by the womenfolk who tell him to be careful and not to fall, and who say, in their kindest voices, how wonderful it is that he keeps his hearing and doesn't seem to fail. They mean well. He knows they mean well. But there's something in that tenderness that feels like a sentence. A gentle, loving, inescapable sentence to the category of people who are almost done. And there's a kind of quiet defiance in the way he pushes back against it. He reads everything he can get his hands on. Books of travel, accounts of voyages, anything that smells of salt water and far places. He keeps up with the shipping news the way other old men keep up with politics. And he can tell you which routes are busy and which have gone quiet and what the new steam packets are doing to the old sail trade. He isn't done with the world. The world may be done with him, but he isn't done with it. And the distinction matters to him enormously, though he'd never say so in those terms. There's a letter he wrote once. He mentioned it almost in passing, but it stayed with me. A letter to an old acquaintance in another port. At the top he wrote out the exact latitude and longitude of Brimbury, the way a captain would log his ship's position in the middle of the ocean, as if the farmhouse were just another vessel, and the fields around it just another kind of ocean. And at the bottom he signed off, with esteem and respect, Arthur Ashwell, condemned as unseaworthy. It was a joke. He meant it as a joke. But jokes like that come from a real place. And the real place is this, that somewhere inside himself, Captain Ashwell has accepted the verdict that the world has handed down. He's no longer seaworthy. He's no longer needed on a quarterdeck. He's no longer the man who could read the sky 3 days out and bring a ship through weather that would have broken a lesser captain. He's an old man on a farm with a tidy woodpile and a flag-bottomed chair and a view of fields that will never, no matter how long he stares at them, turn into the sea. You know what I think about when I think about Captain Ashwell? I think about how many people there are right now who are living 2 miles from the thing they love. Not because anything terrible happened. Not because anyone was cruel. Just because life arranged itself that way. A spouse's needs, a family's expectations, a farm that came from a brother, a promise that was easier to keep than to break. And they do what Ashwell does. They go on. They make the best of it. They scrape the barnacles every few weeks and they sign their letters with a joke that isn't entirely a joke, and they keep their brightness, their sparrow's chirp, because the alternative is a silence that would worry everyone around them. It's a kind of courage that doesn't look like courage at all. It looks like cheerfulness. It looks like making do. But Ashwell isn't finished with us yet. He has a story he wants to tell. A story he's been saving, the way a man saves the best tobacco for after supper. He's adroit about it too. He steers the conversation the way he must have steered a ship, with small adjustments, almost invisible corrections of course, leading you gently toward the point where the story can come in naturally, as if it had simply arrived on its own. He leans forward in his chair and his eyes get that particular shine, and you can feel him gathering the thread of it, pulling it up from wherever he keeps the things that matter most. It happened a long time ago, he says, when he was a youngster, before the farm, before the wife, before any of it. It happened during the War of 1812, and it's true, he says, every word of it, though some people laugh at him for believing such things. He calls them the captain's yarns, repeating the phrase others use to dismiss him, but his voice has no bitterness in it, only certainty. The afternoon light slants through the elm beside the porch. The chair creaks beneath him. The cat on the railing opens one eye and closes it again, and Captain Ashwell's voice drops low and he begins. When Captain Ashwell was a boy, long before the farm, long before the sea, long before any of the life he'd go on to live, he was an orphan. He doesn't dwell on this. He mentions it the way you'd mention the weather on a day that's already passed, as a fact that belongs to the background of the story rather than to its centre. He was bound out, as orphans often were, to an old man named Josiah Croft, who had a farm on the Ridge Road and 2 grown sons named Andrew and Tobias, and a nephew named Will Harker, whom old Josiah loved better than either of his own boys. Will Harker was the kind of young man that small towns produce every generation and never quite know what to do with. Handsome, hot-tempered, restless, generous when the mood was on him, and impossible when it wasn't. He had a way with people that was like a strong current. It could carry you along very pleasantly, or it could pull you under, depending on which direction it was running. He could charm the storekeeper into extending credit with nothing but a grin and a promise, and he could turn around and start a fight at the tavern an hour later over something nobody else even noticed. Old Josiah, who was himself a mild and patient man, was utterly taken with him. Will could do no wrong in his uncle's eyes. He could eat the last of the bread, borrow the best horse and bring it back lame, disappear for 3 days without a word, and Josiah would simply shake his head and say that the boy meant well. He was just hasty, and he'd settle down in time. Andrew and Tobias bore this with the quiet endurance of men who had stopped expecting fairness from their own father a long time ago. They worked the farm, they kept the fences mended and the hay in, and they watched their father's face light up whenever Will's name was mentioned, and they said nothing. This was during the war with the British in the years after 1812, and Will, being exactly the sort of young man who couldn't sit still while there was trouble to be found, went off on a privateer. He didn't ask permission. He didn't leave a note. He simply vanished one morning, and word came back later through the loose channels of harbour gossip that he'd signed aboard a vessel that was hunting British merchant ships. Old Josiah took it hard. He'd been failing for some time by then, growing confused, slipping in and out of himself the way old people sometimes do, calling for Will in his bad spells and then forgetting he'd called. The sons did what they could. They kept the farm running. They sat with the old man in the evenings and answered his questions and pretended not to notice when he drifted. And young Ashwell, the orphan, the bound boy, watched it all from the corner of the kitchen, quiet as a mouse, storing it up. There's something about the way Ashwell tells this part that changes the air on the porch. His sparrow's chirp goes still. His hands, which are usually in constant motion, come to rest on his knees, and his voice, which normally jumps and darts from thought to thought, slows down and finds a register you haven't heard from him before, something low and steady and careful, as if the words are heavy and need to be set down gently. It was a night in late April, he says. The old man had been worse than usual that whole day. restless, talking to people who weren't there, pulling at his blankets, calling out names that nobody in the house recognised. The women had been tending him since morning, changing the bedding, spooning broth into him when he'd take it, singing the old hymns that sometimes calmed him down. By evening he'd quieted some, and the household settled into the kitchen, the way households do when someone they love is ill in the next room, half attending to the ordinary tasks of supper and half listening, always listening, for a change in the breathing from the bedroom. The fire was going. Pitch knots blazed in the grate and threw their unsteady orange light against the walls, and every now and then a knot would pop and send a spark up the chimney and the shadows would jump. Through the open door you could see the foot of the bed where Josiah lay, and the quilt pulled up to his chest, and the shape of his thin shoulders in the firelight. Ashwell was sitting on a stool by the hearth, close to the warmth. Andrew and Tobias were at the table. Nobody was talking. The house was still. And then something made the boy look up. He doesn't know what it was. He's thought about it for 60 years, and he still can't say what made him turn his head at that particular moment. But he looked toward the bedroom, and there was old Josiah Croft, sitting bolt upright in the bed, his eyes open and burning with a strange, fierce light. Bright as a cat's eyes, Ashwell says, bright as 2 candle flames, staring at something that nobody else in the room could see. "Stop them," the old man said. His voice was clear and sharp, nothing like the wandering mumble they'd been hearing all day. "Stop them!" Andrew and Tobias leapt up and ran to the bed, thinking it was another wild spell, the kind that came over him sometimes and left him thrashing and shouting until they could hold him down. But Josiah didn't thrash. He fell back on the pillows and began to weep. Deep, broken, terrible weeping. The kind that comes from a place so far down inside a person that it sounds like it's been stored there for years. And through the weeping he spoke. "They've done it to him," he said. "They've taken Will." He could see it. He could see the ship, the deck, the men standing back. He could see his boy, his Will, and what they were doing to him, the rope, the yardarm. And he begged them to stop, begged them to cut him down, begged them in a voice that was half a scream and half a prayer, while his 2 sons held him with all their strength, and the young orphan stood frozen by the hearth with the firelight jumping on the walls. I want to pause here for a moment, because this is the part that stays with me. Not what happened on the ship, wherever it was, 3,000 miles away in some cold stretch of ocean. That's the part that belongs to Will Harker, and Will Harker is beyond our reach. We can't help him. We can't change what happened, and dwelling on the details of it, the deck, the rope, the men standing back, wouldn't serve anyone, least of all the young man who met his end there. What stays with me is the old man in the bed. The way a person's love can cut through distance like a blade, can leap across an ocean and arrive, uninvited and unbearable, in a dark bedroom on a farm in New England, and show him the one thing he'd give anything not to see. That is where the real story lives. Not in the violence, but in the seeing. Not in what was done, but in what was felt, 3,000 miles away, by a frail old man who loved someone more than his own peace. There is no name for what Josiah Croft experienced that night. You can call it a vision. You can call it a dream. You can call it the desperate invention of a failing mind that loved someone too much and feared too much for him. But Ashwell, who was there, who saw the old man's eyes and heard his voice, has never called it anything but true. The old man was spent after that. He lay quiet for a long time, saying Will's name over and over softly. The way you'd say a prayer you've said so many times it's become breath. The sons looked at each other and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The next morning Josiah told the neighbours what he'd seen, but nobody paid much attention. He'd been wandering for months, and people had learned to nod and move on. And as his mind drifted back to its usual fog, the night seemed to blur and fade, and life on the farm went on the way it always had, slow and hard and unremarkable. That summer the old man grew weaker. His legs gave out first, and then his appetite, and then his interest in anything beyond the window and the weather, and the slow passage of light across the bedroom wall. The farm went on around him the way farms do. The hay was cut, the fences were mended, the animals were fed and watered and tended, and Josiah lay in his bed and listened to it all happening without him, the sounds of a world that was already moving on. Young Ashwell brought him water and sat with him when the sons were in the fields, reading to him sometimes from the almanac, or just sitting quietly while the old man dozed. and sometimes, in his clearer moments, Josiah would talk about Will. Not the vision, not that terrible April night, but the boy himself. The way he used to laugh, loud and sudden, so that you could hear it all the way across the meadow. The time he caught the biggest trout anyone had ever seen in the Ridge Brook and carried it home on a stick, grinning like he'd conquered a nation. The way his hair curled at the temples when it was wet. Small things. Gentle things. The currency of love when love has nothing left to spend itself on but memory. Toward autumn, the cold set in early. Josiah pulled the quilts higher and spoke less and less, and the light in his eyes, which had been so bright and fierce on that April night, dimmed to something softer and more distant, like a lamp turned down low in a window. He was waiting for something. You could feel it in the room. He was waiting, though he couldn't have told you what for. And then, in the autumn, a man came to the farm. His name was Nat Thorne, and he was a rough, reckless sort of fellow who had sailed on the same privateer as Will Harker. He came up the lane on foot, slowly, as if he'd been putting off this walk for as long as he could, and he had his hat in his hands and a long face, and when he knocked on the door he said he'd brought bad news. They sat him down in the kitchen and gave him cider, and the women gathered close, and Andrew stood by the door with his arms folded, and Nat Thorne told them that the crew had been taken captive and carried into a foreign port and locked in prison, and that Will had caught a fever there and died. "You're lying," said old Josiah from the bedroom in a voice so loud and sharp that everyone in the kitchen flinched. "That isn't how it happened." Nat Thorne went pale. "Don't mind him," Andrew said. "He's been confused. He had a bad dream last spring. We thought he'd forgotten it." But Thorne was already looking at the bedroom door with an expression that wasn't confusion and wasn't guilt, but was something closer to fear. He answered the women's questions. They were crying, the women in the household, and he spoke to them gently enough. But after a few minutes he stood up and caught Andrew's eye and jerked his head toward the yard, and the three of them, Thorne and Andrew and young Ashwell just went outside. Thorne swore. He ran his hands through his hair, and then he said in a low, unsteady voice, "That night, the vision, whatever it was, when exactly did it happen?" Andrew couldn't remember, but Ashwell could. It was the night before old Josiah's grey colt was sold, the 24th of April. And Nat Thorne's face changed, and he said, "On April the 23rd, Will Harker was put to the yardarm. I was there. I saw it happen." He told them the rest, standing in the yard with the autumn light going thin and the chickens scratching in the dirt around their feet. His voice was low, and he kept looking back at the house, at the bedroom window where old Josiah lay, as if the old man might hear him through the glass. Will had been wild after they were taken, wild with rage, wild with the injustice of it, chained to the deck and burning. And a young officer, barely more than a boy himself, had come up to him and taunted him, and Will, in his fury, had struck out with his chained hands, and the blow was harder than anyone expected, and the young officer fell and didn't get up again, and after that it was quick. They dealt with Will before the day was out. Thorne had seen it, and he'd cut Will down afterward, and they'd committed him to the sea, and that was the end of it. He hadn't meant to tell anyone the truth. He'd come to the farm meaning to lie, to give them the gentler story about the fever, because some truths are too sharp to hand to an old man who was already dying. But old Josiah had known. From 3,000 miles away, from his bed on a farm in New England, he'd known. How did he know? Thorne kept saying. How could he possibly know? And Ashwell, who has been telling this story for the better part of his life, and who has had it dismissed and doubted and laughed at more times than he cares to count, finishes it the same way every time. He leans back in his chair and folds his hands and says quietly that he can't account for it, that it's something beyond his understanding, but that it happened exactly as he's told it, and that the dates match, and that old Josiah Croft saw what he saw. He says that everybody, if you press them, has got a story like this one that they believe, even the people who laugh at yours, and that there is more that happens in this world than we have explanations for. I don't know what to do with this story, honestly. I've turned it over and over, the way you'd turn a smooth stone in your hand, looking at it from every angle, and I can't make it smaller or simpler than it is. You can explain it away if you want to. You can say the old man guessed, or dreamed, or that the dates are wrong, or that memory has polished the whole thing into something neater than it was. People have said all of these things to Ashwell over the years, and he doesn't argue with them. He just says quietly that everybody's got a story like this one they believe, even the people who laugh at his. And that's true, isn't it? We all carry one unexplained thing, one moment that doesn't fit the world as we understand it, and we hold it privately and don't bring it out very often. And when we do, we brace ourselves for the smile that says we're being foolish. But sitting there on Ashwell's porch, in the quiet of the afternoon, listening to the voice of a man who was in the room that night and saw those burning eyes and heard that terrible weeping, I find I don't want to explain it away. I want to let it be what it is, a thing that happened, a mystery that the people who lived through it carried for the rest of their lives without ever quite understanding it. And maybe that's enough. Maybe not every story needs to be solved. Maybe some of them just need to be told and then set down gently and left to rest. The elm makes a soft sound in the breeze. Captain Ashwell is quiet now. The cat on the railing stretches, yawns, and tucks its nose back under its paw. There's a morning when the fog comes in, not the hard, grey, blinding kind that shuts the harbour down, but the softer sort, the kind that drifts in from the open water like a slow exhalation and hangs in the air just thick enough to blur the edges of things. The wharves look like pencil drawings in it, all suggestion and no hard lines. The masts of the old brig vanish halfway up, and the water underneath the pilings goes white and still, and you can't see the far side of the harbour at all, only a pale brightness where the shore ought to be. It's the kind of fog that makes sound behave strangely. Voices carry farther than they should, and footsteps on the plank seem to come from everywhere at once, and the low clang of a bell buoy out past the breakwater sounds as close as if it were sitting on the wharf beside you. Everything is muffled and softened and slowed down, and the town itself seems to hold its breath, waiting for the sun to burn through. On a morning like this, the captains don't gather in their usual spot. The planks are damp, and the air is too heavy, and most of them have the kind of joints that can feel a fog coming before it arrives. But if you walk a little farther down the harbour, past the last of the working fish houses, you'll find a low, wide building, set back from the water behind a tangle of old rope and discarded buoys. Its door is usually shut. Its windows are clouded with salt and cobweb. But this morning, for the first time, the door is open, and a thin curl of pipe smoke drifts out into the fog, and sitting just inside, in a chair he's cobbled together from salvaged timber and old canvas, is Captain Frederick Wardle. He's been expecting you. Not specifically, he's not the sort to make arrangements or issue invitations, but in the general way of a man who keeps his door open on foggy mornings because he knows that someone sooner or later will wander by and look in. He's a gentle man, Wardell, quieter than the others, with a way of looking at you that's more attentive than you'd expect from someone his age, as if he's actually listening to what you say instead of waiting for his turn to talk. His face has the same deep sea weathering as the rest, but his eyes are darker, brown rather than blue, and there's something in them that's closer to tenderness than anything else you've seen on this wharf. He speaks slowly, without the droning authority of Captain Hale or the sparrow chirp of Captain Ashwell, but with a kind of careful honesty that makes you lean in, because you sense that everything he says he means. "Come in and sit down," he says, the way you'd invite someone into your home. It's nothing special to look at, just a lot of old things I've collected over the years, things the women up at the house won't have under their roof, but I can't seem to part with any of it. And he looks around the room with a fondness that's almost shy, as if he's half expecting you to laugh at him for it. His wife, he admits, has told him 100 times to clear the place out and burn what's in it, or at least let the building for a fish house since it's sitting there taking up harbour frontage. He says this without complaint, more with the good-natured resignation of a man who has heard the same suggestion for 30 years and has no intention of following it. "There are some things in here that mean a great deal to me," he says quietly, "and that's the end of the argument and always has been, but you won't laugh. Not once you see what's here." It takes your eyes a moment to adjust. The room is dim, lit only by the grey fog light coming through the open door and the 2 salt-crusted windows, and the shapes inside are strange and crowded and layered upon one another like the contents of a ship's hold that's been packed by someone who couldn't bear to leave anything behind. There are oars leaning against the far wall, whole ones long as a man and their blades worn smooth by decades of use. There's the old sail from his fishing boat, folded and stacked on a shelf, alongside coils of rope so stiff with age they've taken on the permanent curves of the hooks they hung from. A sailor's hammock is slung across the beam overhead, sagging in the middle with the ghost of a body's weight. In one corner, a heap of worn-out canvas and line has been left to rest, and in another a ship's capstan stands alone like a short iron pillar, its bars long gone, its drum flecked with rust. And then there are the stranger things, great lumps of pink and white coral, rough and heavy, sitting on the floor like rocks from some other planet. Shells the size of dinner plates, their insides still faintly iridescent beneath the dust. A hornet's nest as big as a man's head, dry and papery and perfectly intact, hanging from a nail in the rafter. The enormous red shell of a lobster, so large you'd swear it was made up until you pick it up and feel the weight and the realness of it. The ridges of the claw, the dry scrape of it against your palm. Boxes everywhere, wooden boxes, tin boxes, canvas bags with their drawstrings pulled tight, all stuffed with things that Captain Wardell has carried home from every harbour and every crossing and every long, slow day at sea, because he couldn't let them go, because throwing things away felt too much like forgetting, and forgetting was the one thing he wouldn't do. There's a piece of wreck timber on the wall, grey and salt-bleached, and running through it at an angle, embedded so deeply that only half of it shows, is the sword of a swordfish, a long, pointed blade of bone, broken off where the fish drove it into the hull with a force you can hardly imagine. Captain Wardell sawed it out of the wreck himself back in his youth, when the ship in question came ashore on the point in a storm. He's kept it ever since. Close to 60 years now, this piece of bone and wood has lived in this warehouse, outlasting every ship the captain ever sailed and most of the men he sailed with. His wife has never understood why he keeps it. His neighbours have never understood. It's just a piece of wreckage with a fisher's weapon stuck in it, and to anyone else it would be firewood. But Wardell runs his finger along the smooth bone and looks at it the way you'd look at something sacred. And I think I understand, even if I can't quite put it into words. It's evidence. Evidence that the ocean is alive and powerful and strange, and that a fish no one ever saw drove its sword into a ship no one remembers, and both of them are gone now. But this one piece of proof remains, and it matters to him that it does. And this, you might ask, noticing the carved head that leans against the wall beneath the oars. It's a figurehead, a woman's head and shoulders, carved from a single block of wood, her hair falling in long curls over her shoulders, her face lifted, her eyes looking out towards something you can't see. The paint is almost gone. Dust has settled into the grooves of the carving and filled the hollows of her eyes. But even faded and battered and half buried in cobweb, there is something in her face that holds you. A wildness, a strange beauty, a look of purpose that the years haven't been able to wear away. She was found on the long sands after a storm, Wardell tells you, and his voice takes on the cadence of a story he's heard since childhood, passed down from his father like an heirloom. A brig out of Denmark had broken up on the reef, the very spot where the lighthouse was later built, and this was all that came ashore in one piece. It was a terrible storm, he says. 3 ships went down within 5 miles of Brimbury that night, and the sound of the wind was so loud that people in the town couldn't hear each other speak even indoors, and the spray reached the upper windows of the houses nearest the harbour. The Danish brig was smashed to splinters. People said she'd been carrying treasure, gold, perhaps, or silver, or something precious enough to make men risk a winter crossing. And when Wardell was a boy, he used to wade out to the reef at low tide and search the rocks for coins, turning over stones and poking into crevices with a stick, dreaming the way boys dream of sunken treasure. He never found anything. But his father walked the long beach the morning after, through the wrack and the broken timber, and found her lying face up in the sand, staring at the sky with her carved eyes, as if she were still watching for the port she'd never reach. She's been here ever since. No one has claimed her. No one has ever written to ask after her. The brig that carried her is splinters in the sand, and the men who sailed her are long gone, and whatever port she was carved for doesn't know she still exists. But Captain Wardell keeps her. He keeps everything. And then there's the chest. It sits on a shelf near the back of the room, partly hidden behind a coil of old anchor line, and you might not notice it at all if Wardell didn't point it out. It's small, no bigger than a hat box, and painted a dark sea-faded blue, with rope handles at either end worked into beautiful intricate knots that even you can tell were made by hands that knew what they were doing. The knots alone are a kind of art. Tight, symmetrical, patient work done in some quiet hour at sea by a man with nothing but time and rope and the skill to turn them into something worth looking at. Captain Waddell lifts the lid carefully, the hinges stiff with age and salt. Inside there isn't much. A round wooden box with initials and an anchor and a date carved into the top. The kind of idle, careful work a man does when the watch is long and the sea is calm. Open the box and you find a sailmaker's kit. A bundle of heavy needles, a leather palm for pushing them through canvas, a little string of spare buttons and a small bag of yarn and thread neatly sewn, with a particular care that suggests it was made by someone who loved the person it was meant for. His mother, perhaps. A woman in a Mediterranean port sewing a little bag for her son before he sailed, filling it with the things he'd need to mend his clothes at sea, and beside the kit a small buckle, green and gilt, broken, the kind of cheap pretty thing a young man might pick up off the ground in some foreign street because the colour caught his eye, and folded carefully at the bottom, a paper, his protection paper, certifying him as a citizen, describing him as having dark hair and dark complexion. He was Italian, Captain Wardle says, and his voice changes when he talks about this man. It goes softer and gruffer, in the way that tenderness sometimes sounds like roughness when it comes from someone who isn't used to showing it. The young man who sailed on the Dorado for 3 or 4 voyages, maybe more, and who was liked by everyone who knew him. Waddell himself had shipped with him once, before he went out as mate on another vessel, and he remembered the young man's face and his voice, and his particular quality of making other people feel better about whatever they were doing. He had a pleasant voice, and a way of cracking a joke when the other men up in the rigging were cold or tired, or cross about something, and whatever he said would get the whole crew laughing, and the work went easier after that. He could tie a knot that would make a boatswain weep with envy, and he kept a set of rosary beads that he wouldn't let anyone joke about. He'd flare up like a lit match if they tried, fierce and sudden, though he took everything else with good humour and never held a grudge. He was quick and sure-footed, the kind of man you wanted up in the rigging because he moved through the ropes the way a cat moves through branches, without looking, without thinking, his body knowing where every line and stay would be before his hands reached for them. He talked about his mother sometimes. Waddell remembers that, the way the young man's voice would change when he mentioned her, going quiet, going private, as if he were talking to himself rather than to the men around him. On the return from Callao, somewhere off the Bermudas, with a heavy sea running, he fell from the upper yard. That's all Captain Waddell says about it, and his voice goes quiet when he says it, and he closes the lid of the chest gently, the way you'd close a door on a room where someone is sleeping. They tried to send what he had to his mother, his pay, his savings, whatever they could gather. Whether it reached her, Waddell doesn't know. And then Captain Waddell says something that I don't think I'll forget. He says it simply, looking at the chest with no drama and no emphasis, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. We think we're somebody, he says. We get our time in the sun. But it doesn't take long before the world moves on and nobody remembers. I sit with that for a while, in the quiet of the warehouse, with the fog pressing softly against the windows and the smell of old rope and salt-cured wood, and the faintest trace of pipe tobacco hanging in the still air. He's right, of course. The young Italian is forgotten. His mother in that Mediterranean port is forgotten. She who sewed the little bag and filled it with needles and thread, not knowing it was the last useful thing she'd ever give her son. The woman on the figurehead is forgotten. The ship whose hull stopped the swordfish is forgotten, and someday Captain Waddell himself will be forgotten, and this warehouse will be emptied, and these things will be scattered or burned or left to rot, and nobody will know what they meant or why they were kept. But right now, in this room, in this fog, they're still here. The needles are still sharp. The knots are still tight. The carved woman's eyes are still looking out towards something none of us can see. And there is a kind of dignity in that, in the simple fact of lasting, of being held, of sitting in a quiet room while the world outside forgets. That's what this warehouse is, I think. It isn't a museum. It isn't a memorial. It's an act of stubbornness. One old man's refusal to let go of the evidence that certain lives were lived, Certain voyages were made, certain storms were survived, and certain ones were not. His wife calls it clutter. The town calls it peculiar. But I think Captain Wardell, without quite knowing it, has done something that matters. He's kept faith with the dead. He's kept their small possessions safe and dry and out of the weather, and when someone comes to his door and asks to see them, he opens the chest and shows them. And for a few minutes the young Italian is not forgotten, and the carved woman is not forgotten, and the world is a little less careless than it was. The fog thickens outside. The bellbuoy clangs, slow and far away, and somewhere in the harbour a gull cries once and goes silent. Captain Wardell relights his pipe, and the match flares briefly in the dim room, and the smoke rises in a thin straight line, and neither of us says anything for a long time. The fog burns off by midday, and by afternoon the harbour is bright and still, and Captain Wardell is in his dory with a pair of oars and a bucket of clambait, and he's asked if you'd like to come along. You would. You very much would. He rows with the slow, measured stroke of a man who has been pulling boats since before he could read, each oar entering the water at exactly the same angle, each stroke covering exactly the same distance, so that the dory glides forward in a straight line without the slightest wobble or correction. It's the kind of rowing that looks effortless but isn't. The kind that comes from doing a thing so many thousands of times that your body has memorised every motion and your mind is free to go wherever it likes. And Captain Wardell's mind, once it's free, likes to go back. Back to the old days. Back to the harbour when it was full of ships and noise and purpose. Back to the stories his grandfather told him, and the stories his grandfather's grandfather told before that, all the way down to the bottom of the well of memory where the water is coldest and clearest. My grandther, he says, settling the oars and letting the dory drift while he baits a hook, understood the weather better than any man I've known. He could read the sky at a glance, the way you or I would read a clock face, and he'd tell you what the afternoon would bring before you'd finished your breakfast. He shakes his head, amused and faintly scornful. Most folks in those days pinned everything on the moon, you know, whether to salt the ship, whether to plant, whether to cut their timber. All of it had to wait for the right lunar quarter, or the whole business would go wrong. Granther thought that was foolishness. He judged by the shape of the clouds and what the air felt like on his skin, and he was nearly always right. He said you couldn't build a dependable rule around something as far off as the moon. There's a quiet pleasure in the way Wardell tells these stories, not performing them, the way Captain Hale performs the Bristol cloth, but simply laying them out one after another, the way you'd lay out the contents of a drawer. He reaches for them without effort. They're all right there. He tells you about a captain he sailed under once years ago, who was possessed by lunar superstition the way other men are possessed by drink. They'd been in port at Cadiz for 10 days, and the ship badly needed her salt replenished. The mate kept warning that they were running low and had a long voyage ahead, but the captain refused to allow it because the moon was on the wane. No argument could shift him. He was a fine seaman in every other way, Wardell says, and died a wealthy man. But on this one question he was as immovable as granite. The mate, who happened to be his own brother, fought him bitterly over it, the two of them quarrelling like alley cats in the cabin, while young Wardell sat up in the rigging greasing the mizzenmast and pretended not to hear. The salt waited until the moon turned. The voyage went fine, as it happened, and the captain took this as proof that he'd been right all along, which only made the mate more furious. And then there was the time, the same captain, or one very like him, when they were riding at anchor in the stream, everything stowed and trimmed, the crew already up in the ropes waiting for the order, and suddenly the captain told them to take in every stitch of canvas and batten down. No reason, no explanation. The men swore under their breath. The mate threw his hands up, but that night a storm tore through the harbour so savagely that they were shaking with relief to still be moored. An old vessel nearby dragged her ground tackle and had her upper sails ripped clean away. And we sat there snug as a church, Wardell says, with a slow nod. I don't know whether that was the moon or something else entirely, but he knew. Somehow or other, he knew. You know what I find myself thinking about, listening to these stories? It's the question of how much of what we call instinct is really knowledge that we've lost the name for. These old sailors, Wardell's grandfather, the moon captain, even Mrs. Pennell up at the lighthouse, who can feel a storm coming in her knees before the barometer drops. They lived so close to the weather, so close to the sea that their bodies learned things their minds never bothered to put into words. And now that way of knowing is fading, just like the harbour is silting up, and pretty soon nobody will be able to read the sky the way Wardell's grandfather could, and we'll have lost something that we can't get back, and we won't even know exactly what it was. The dory drifts on the gentle swell. Wardell drops his line over the side and watches it sink. He has a way of going quiet for a few minutes and then starting up again with a new story, as if the silence itself were a kind of bait, and the stories were fish that rose to it when they were ready. After a while, he begins to talk about what Brimbury used to be, and this is different from the quiet, faded town you've been walking through. This is Brimbury alive. You could hear the shipwrights' hammers every day of the year, he says, sun up to sundown, ringing off the harbour like bells. The yards were busy through every season, and all winter long the country farmers would come rolling in with cartloads of oak planking and curved knee braces, and enormous logs of pine for masts, trees so tall and straight and heavy that it took 3 or even 4 teams of oxen to haul a single trunk along the frozen roads. The runners scraped on the ice, the drivers hollered and stamped their feet and blew on their fingers. 2 of those rigs, nose to tail, would have filled the whole harbour road end to end. And the sound of them coming, you could hear it from a mile away, Wardell says. The low groan of the sleds, the crack of the whip and the ox drivers calling out across the frozen morning, their voices carrying through the cold air the way voices carry across water. There was something about that sound, he says, that told you the town was alive, that something was being built, that the harbour still mattered. He misses it. You can hear that in his voice. He misses the hammers and the ox teams and the sawdust on the wharf planks and the smell of fresh-cut pine. He misses the sense that the town was making something, sending something out into the world, instead of sitting still and watching the grass grow between the boards. And the ships they built from those pines, he can list them, everyone, and he does, ticking them off on his fingers the way a man counts his children. There was the old Hannah, blunt and square in the bow, so stubby they joked she'd make the same headway stern, first, and they called her the sugar box because of the shape of her. She was ugly as a rain barrel, but she packed more cargo into her hold than vessels that ranked 50 tons above her, and every harbour from here to New Orleans knew her by sight. She sailed for years and years out of Brimbury, and Wardell says her timbers were so stout that he wouldn't be surprised if pieces of her were still floating somewhere out in the Pacific where she was finally sold to buyers on the far coast. And there was the Dorian, squat, headstrong, willing enough before the wind with a light cargo, but dead in the water if you loaded her heavy. You'd have better luck, Wardell says, trying to push a barn across a pond with a bedsheet for a sail. He tells it with the affectionate exasperation of a man talking about a horse that only trotted when the mood struck. These weren't elegant ships, but they were Brimbury ships, and the men who built them and sailed them and cursed them are gone now, and the timber pines are gone, and the shipyards are silent. He goes quiet for a moment after that, looking down at his line in the water. Then he picks up again, lighter this time, with a gleam in his eye that tells you the next story is going to have some mischief in it. Sailors, he says, can get into anything. It's practically a science. Say you're carrying champagne in sealed baskets. Every bottle wired and waxed, every basket counted and inspected. There's no honest way in. But the crew doesn't need to uncork anything. They fetch up a basket, find themselves a clean tub, and shake and bounce the whole thing until the glass shatters inside and the wine drains through the wicker into the tub below. Then they stow the ruined basket back in the hold with the others, and when the cargo arrives at its destination, the merchant finds broken glass and a single surviving bottle, and files a furious complaint about reckless stowing. Wardell tells this with a perfectly straight face, and you get the feeling that he may have been present on 1 or 2 occasions when this particular technique was demonstrated. And then there's the matter of 2 shipmasters who came into the same port at roughly the same time, one of them wearing a sharp new suit and the other looking threadbare. The threadbare captain asked where the clothes came from. "Bristol," said the other. "You didn't get yourself a set while you were there?" "No," said the first. "I can't afford it on what they pay me." The well-dressed captain grinned. "You charge it to the ship." So the next time out, the threadbare captain visited the best tailor in Bristol, charged the bill to the ship's accounts, and came home feeling very pleased with himself until the ship's husband examined the ledger and asked what this tailor's charge was all about. The captain, mortified, explained what he'd been told to do. The ship's husband laughed and crossed it out, and the captain, fuming, found his well-dressed friend and gave him an earful, and the friend, baffled, said, "You actually wrote down that it was a tailor. I always listed mine under sailcloth." Wardell's wheezy chuckle fades into the sound of water against the hull. The sky is clouded over, and the light on the water has gone from gold to silver, and the lighthouse stands pale and still on its reef in the distance. He tells you about Havana next, a customs inspector who came aboard when Wardell first brought a ship into that port. The vessel hadn't been registered there before, so an official needed to survey her dimensions and enter them in the books, and after that she'd owe duties on every future visit based on whatever figures got recorded. The inspector paced the decks, went below, measured between the beams, and wrote down nothing. Back in the cabin, he produced 2 gold coins, held one over each eye, and said with a slow grin, "If I cannot see, how can I know what number you choose to write?" So Wardell took the ledger and put her down at 20 tons below her true size, and the inspector pocketed his gold and rowed back to shore, whistling. It wasn't square dealing, Wardell admits, and he says it with that careful honesty of his, neither proud nor ashamed, just stating it plainly. But every captain who could manage it did the same, because the port charges in places like Havana would swallow your entire profit otherwise, and the owners back home would have you farming hay if you came back empty-handed. And then, because one story always leads to the next, the way one wave follows another, he tells you about Captain Theodore Waverley and the embargo. The government had shut down foreign trade and Brimbury was strangling. Ships sat idle at every wharf, their sails furled and their hulls going green with weed. Men who had worked the docks their whole lives sat in their kitchens and looked at their hands and didn't know what to do with them. Wardell says the town never fully recovered from those years, that the embargo cracked something in Brimbury's spine, and though the trade came back afterward, it came back diminished, and the slow decline that followed can be traced straight to those terrible months when the harbour was full and silent and nobody was allowed to sail. Captain Waverley quietly purchased a battered old brig that nobody wanted, tucked away in a cove east of town, and began fitting her out in secret. Farmers came by night with dried fish and cut lumber and sacks of potatoes, grateful for any buyer at all. The brig sat at a hidden wharf, and they were careful not to paint her or draw any notice. One afternoon, Waverley was dining at a gentleman's table in the next town, and the revenue officer sitting beside him mentioned cheerfully that he'd received word about a vessel loading illegally near Brimbury, and planned to ride over and seize her that very day. Waverley excused himself as soon as he dared, hired the fastest horse in town and rode like the devil. Every soul turned out to help. They finished loading, bent on the sails, and got her underway just as the revenue men came thundering down to the cove, commandeered a boat, and clambered aboard. Waverley, calm as a deacon, invited the officers below for a glass of wine. While they hesitated, the wind freshened into a proper gust, and the crew had canvas spread before anyone could draw breath. And by the time the officers were back on deck, the old brig was making for open water, and the people on shore were cheering from the wharves. Waverley offered his guests passage to the Caribbean. They preferred not. They agreed to keep quiet about the whole affair if he'd put them back on dry land, and he had the boat lowered about 2 miles offshore and watched them pull for the beach, looking considerably less official than they had on the way out. He made a fine voyage and a solid profit, and everyone in Brimbury wished they'd thought of it first. There's something about the way Wardell tells that last story, with quiet admiration, with the faintest spark of longing, that makes you understand something about this man that he'd never say outright. He loved the sea. He loved the daring and the cleverness and the sheer brass of it. And he misses it. Not just the voyages, but the world itself. The world in which a captain could outrun a government officer and sail off with a hold full of potatoes, and the whole town would cheer because that's what Brimbury was for. That's what these men were for. They were sharp and they were bold and they bent the rules when the rules were stupid, and they came home with money in their pockets and stories in their heads, and the town loved them for it. I think that's what the fishing trips are really about for Wardell. It isn't the fish, it's the being out here, the gentle motion of the boat, the line going down into the dark water, the sky above him doing the things that skies do, changing and shifting and telling its weather stories in the old language his grandfather taught him. Out here, for a few hours, The world is the right shape again. Out here, he's still a captain. That world is gone now. The harbour is quiet, the champagne baskets are safe, and Captain Wardell sits in his dory with a fishing line and a bucket of bait, and the stories rise up around him like the tide, one after another, until the afternoon is used up and the light is fading and it's time to row home. The oars dip, the water parts, and in the distance, softly, the lighthouse begins to glow. He's down at the end of the harbour, in the last of the fish houses, and you might walk past him 3 times before you noticed he was there. He doesn't announce himself. He doesn't look up. He's sitting on an overturned crate with a knife in one hand and a porgy in the other, slicing it with quick, practiced motions. A cut down one side, a cut down the other, the backbone tossed into a bucket, the 2 thin slices laid aside for bait. His hands move without his eyes. He could do this in his sleep. He probably has. His name is Jem, and he is, by every measure the town would use, the least important person in Brimbury. He has no rank, no title, no house, no family. He isn't a captain, and never was. He doesn't sit on the wharf with the old men and argue about tonnage, and if he did, they'd make room for him politely enough, but nobody would ask for his opinion. He is a fisherman, just a fisherman, and he lives alone in a room above one of the sheds, and he wears the same bright red flannel shirt every day of his life, faded to a colour somewhere between rust and brick, and he walks with a limp that he doesn't explain, and he keeps to himself with the particular quietness of a man who learned early that nobody was especially interested in hearing what he had to say. The fish house itself is a strange kind of workshop. A seine hangs from the crossbeams overhead, draped like a heavy cobweb across the rafters. There are tangled lines and barrows for carrying fish, like wheelbarrows without the wheels, and round lobster nets stacked in the corners, and barrels of bait, and heaps of clamshells and strange bones and dried sea things nailed to the walls as decoration or for luck. The whole place smells of brine and wet wood, and the sharp, honest smell of fish that have just come out of the sea. And through the wide doorway you can see the harbour, and the rocks, and the slow pulse of the tide going out. But there's something about him. You notice it the way you'd notice a current in still water. Not on the surface, but in the way things move around him. The cats notice it. There are always cats in the fish houses, thin, cautious, half-wild creatures that drift in and out of the doorways like smoke, and most of them won't come near a person. But they come near Jem. When he starts slivering the porgies, they appear one by one from behind barrels and under boats, and they sit near him in a loose circle, quiet and watchful. And when he tosses the heads and backbones aside, they eat without haste and without quarrelling, as if they understand that there will be enough. He was the one who found them last winter, the cats. He and another fisherman were up in Captain Aldridge's old storehouse, the same Captain Aldridge whose empty house stands at the top of the harbour road, looking for a barrel of salt that someone had stowed there months ago. It was a brutal day, he says, thin icy rain coming in sideways from every direction, the sea roaring on the rocks as if it wanted to come ashore and flatten everything. Jem tipped over a cask that had something heavy at the bottom, and out came a rush of fur and claws and yowling. 9 cats, packed into the barrel together, huddled against each other for warmth through the worst of the cold. They'd been living on whatever they could scavenge, which wasn't much, because a dog belonging to a visiting coaster had been chasing them away from the fish houses for weeks. Jem carried them down fresh fish that evening and fed them, and he kept feeding them through the rest of the winter, even on days when the catch was poor and he could barely feed himself. I keep thinking about that. The man who barely has enough, making sure the cats don't go hungry. There's a word for it that I don't want to use because it would make Jem uncomfortable. He'd shrug it off. He'd say he was brought up to be good to animals and that's all there was to it. And anyway, fish cost him nothing but time. But it's more than that. There's a tenderness in him that runs deep and quiet, like an underground spring. And it comes out not in words but in small acts. The way he tosses a fish head closer to the smallest cat. The way he keeps his voice low so as not to startle them. The way he pauses in his work sometimes and just watches them eat, with an expression on his weathered face that's close to peace. He was an orphan. He tells you this quietly without asking for sympathy, the way you'd tell someone which road you took to get here. Just a fact about the route his life followed. His mother died when he was not yet 9, and he was placed with a tanner who worked him hard and treated him poorly, and he hated the man and the work, and as soon as he was old enough to be useful, he ran off and went to sea, and he's been at sea in one way or another ever since. Nobody came looking for him. He supposes he wasn't worth the trouble of finding. He says this without bitterness. It's just the shape of his life, and he's had a long time to get used to it. He's been hurt at sea. That's where the limp comes from. He fell from a yard high up on the mast all the way down to the deck and broke himself badly. He doesn't tell you the details, and you don't ask. He just says he was laid up for a long while, and they took him to a hospital in a foreign port, and it was run by nuns. And here his voice changes. Not louder, not softer, but different somehow. As if he's opened a door inside himself that he usually keeps shut, and the air from the room behind it is warmer than you expected. They were real ladies, the nuns, he says. They wore great white things on their heads, and when he first arrived he was frightened of them, because he wasn't used to being inside a proper building, let alone being tended by women who spoke gently and moved quietly and seemed to care whether he lived or died. One of them in particular took charge of him. She'd sit up through the night when the pain was bad, and she'd bring him food and hold his head up on her arm when he was too weak to lift it himself, and she never seemed to mind any of it. Not the ugliness of his injuries, not the roughness of his manners, not the silence that sat between them because he couldn't think of a single proper thing to say to a woman like that. He keeps coming back to her. You can feel him circling the memory the way a moth circles a lamp, not wanting to touch it directly, but unable to leave it alone. She gave him a little book when he left, he says. He can't read well, but he kept it. He's always kept it. And when he was getting better, when he could finally sit upright and see through the window, she was so pleased that she clapped her hands, and he could see that his getting well meant something to her, genuinely meant something, and that was the strangest feeling he'd ever had. That someone who owed him nothing was glad he was alive. He doesn't say the next part easily. He looks down at the knife in his hands and turns it slowly, watching the light catch the blade, as if he's deciding whether to go on. And then he says, very quietly, that when he left the hospital he was close to crying. He wanted to tell her what she'd done for him, but the words wouldn't come. He's a clumsy man when it comes to saying things, he says, and he always has been. And standing there in the doorway with the little book she'd given him pressed against his chest, all he could do was nod and turn away. He'd never told anyone that before, he thinks, and he's telling it now because it came out on its own and he can't seem to put it back. It reminded him, he says, of being small, of being a child in a clean bed with someone doing for him, of his mother before she died. That's all. He doesn't elaborate. He picks up a porgy and begins to slice it, and the moment passes, but you can see it settling into him, the way rain settles into dry ground, and you understand that this is the truest thing he owns. That memory of being cared for, in a white room, by a woman whose language he couldn't speak, in a country whose name he's half forgotten. And then there's the cat. He tells you about her shyly, as if he expects to be laughed at. One afternoon, when his coaster was tied up alongside a bridge in Charlestown, he heard a terrible crying from the water below, thin, sharp, desperate, and he looked over the side and saw a young cat clinging to one of the bridge pilings, soaked through and shaking, while a group of boys on the bridge above were pitching stones at her. One stone had already found its mark. Her eye was gone on one side, bloodied and closed, and one of her legs was hurt. Jem dropped into the small boat and pushed off, and he got to her just as she lost her grip and went under. He fished her out, a wet, miserable, broken thing, more dead than alive, and took her aboard and set her by the stove. He thought she'd be gone by morning, but in the morning she was still there, and she licked his finger, and she purred. He says the sound of it, that thin, rattling purr from a cat that had almost drowned and lost an eye, and had every reason in the world to distrust anything human, was one of the most startling things he'd ever heard. He fed her a little chowder, she ate it and purred harder, and that was the beginning. He kept her aboard the coaster for nearly 2 years, and in that time she became the centre of his days in a way that he couldn't have predicted and wouldn't have believed if someone had told him. She slept in his bunk, curled against his side, and her purring was the last sound he heard before sleep, and the first thing he was aware of in the morning. She came up on deck during his watch and sat near him while he worked, and on calm nights, when the stars were sharp and the water was black and the only sound was the creak of the rigging, she'd sit on the rail beside him and look out at the dark with her one good eye, and he'd talk to her quietly about nothing in particular, just to have someone to talk to. He'd fish for her in the mornings when they were in port, drop a line over the side and pull up a cunner or two for her, and she knew, somehow, when the fishing was for her. She'd crouch at the rail and watch the line with her one good eye, and the moment she saw it twitch she'd be ready, and she'd pounce on the fish and carry it off growling softly, full of pride. But here's the thing Jem wants you to understand. She never touched the ship's catch. Not once. When they were hauling mackerel or haddock for the market, she'd sit and watch without lifting a paw. She knew the difference. She knew which fish were hers and which were not, and she conducted herself accordingly with a kind of dignity that Jem still marvels at. She'd go ashore sometimes when they were in port, and come back with a mouse or a small bird, and she'd bring it to him first, lay it at his feet, and look up at him with that one bright eye as if to say, "I've been working too." She didn't need to be shut in, she always came back. She was, Jem says, the most faithful thing he'd ever known, and he says it with a plainness that doesn't ask for sentiment. He isn't sentimental. He's just telling you what happened. She was marked black and white, he says, and she kept herself as clean as any cat you ever saw. She knew when bad weather was coming. She'd pace and fuss and act unsettled, and sure enough the sky would darken and the wind would come around, and she'd take herself below and wait it out. But in fair weather she'd sit on deck like a queen, her one eye half shut against the sun, her tail curled neatly around her paws, and Jem says there were days when she was the best company he had, better than any of the crew, who were decent enough fellows but didn't have much to say. He lost her in Salem. It was a windy night, the schooner pitching and rolling, dragging at her anchor, and Jem was up and down all night tending to things. The last he saw of her, she'd eaten the supper he'd given her, milk, which he used to buy for her now and then as a treat, and settled in her usual spot. By morning she was gone. He looked for her. He walked the waterfront and called for her and asked at every boat and every dock. Nothing. She was just gone. Maybe she missed her footing in the dark. Maybe a wave took her. He doesn't know. He's never gone into Salem Harbour since without looking for her, scanning the wharves and the alleys and the dark spaces under the pilings, and he's never seen her. There's something I don't quite know how to say about Jem's story. It isn't sad in the way that stories about captains and lost ships are sad, grand and dramatic, with storms and wrecks and tonnage. It's sad the way a quiet room is sad when someone has just left it. The loneliness in Jem's life isn't the kind that announces itself. It's the kind that sits in the corner and waits, patient and undemanding, and has been sitting there since he was 9 years old, and his mother died and nobody came looking. He's had moments of warmth. The nun's white hands, the cat's rough tongue, the sound of purring in the dark. But they came to him the way windfalls come to a man walking under an apple tree. Unexpected, ungrasped, and brief. He didn't go looking for love. He doesn't know the word for what he lost. But when it found him, in the shape of a drowned cat or a foreign nun, he recognised it, and he held it carefully, and when it went away again he let it go without complaint, because that is what the world has taught him to expect. And yet he isn't unhappy. That's the part I want to hold on to. He has the fish houses. He has his work, which is steady and simple, and asks nothing of him except his hands and his patience. He has the cats, who come to him every evening and accept what he offers without judgment or obligation. He has the memory of the nun's white hands lifting his head, and the sound of a one-eyed cat purring in the dark beside him, and the feeling of fair weather on the deck of a clean ship with the sun shining and the wind behind him. He told me once, very quietly, that if he could have anything in the world he'd want a tidy little schooner freshly painted with a stripe along her side and clean sails and a good wind with the sun behind it. That's all. Nothing grand. Nothing anyone else would call ambition. That would be enough. The porgies are all finished now. The cats have eaten their share and dispersed into the shadows. Jem wipes his knife on his trouser leg and drives it into the beam overhead, where it sticks and quivers and goes still. The boat ride out to the lighthouse is short, but it changes everything. You leave the harbour behind, the wharves, the fish houses, the tilted dories, all of it, and within a few minutes you're out on the open water, and the land has become something you look at rather than something you stand on. The rocks where the lighthouse sits are low and dark, fringed with weed that lifts and falls in the swell, and the tower itself rises from them like a white finger pointing at the sky. It's a slender thing to be standing out here alone, where the sea has nothing between it and the far side of the world. On storm nights, when the waves come in so hard that people in the village can hear the roar from their beds, this small tower holds its ground and keeps its lamp burning, and there's a kind of quiet stubbornness in that which makes you want to know the people who live inside it. The landing is tricky, even on a calm day. You have to time the swell and step quickly from the boat onto the wet rocks, and there's a moment when you're balanced between the two. One foot in the dory, one on the slippery weed, and the sea decides whether to let you come ashore or send you back. Today, it lets you through. You climb the rough path through the rocks, past the keeper's garden where nothing much grows except a few wind-flattened herbs and some tenacious beach roses, and you reach the door. Mrs. Constance Purnell meets you there the way she meets everyone, with her sleeves rolled up, her apron enormous and white as a cloud, and an expression on her face that suggests she's been expecting you but is prepared to be amused by whatever you might do next. She's a sharp woman, Mrs. Pennell, and a funny one, though you'd have to listen carefully to catch it, because her humour comes at you sideways, dry and quiet, tucked into the middle of a sentence the way a bone is tucked into a fish. She never raises her voice. She never laughs at her own remarks. She just says them and moves on, and leaves you a beat behind, wondering if she really just said what you think she said. Her husband, Mr. Purnell, is a quieter soul, a large, patient, mechanical-minded man who has, in partnership with his nephew, turned the lighthouse into a kind of ongoing engineering experiment. They've invented catches for propping doors wide and devices to shut them, brackets for every conceivable object that might be hung on a wall, special attachments for the stove that nobody else would have thought of, and an elaborate system of bolts and bars for the front entrance that could probably withstand a battering ram. Mrs. Pennell notes, with the faintest trace of amusement, that the door is usually left standing wide open all summer anyway. The nephew is a shy, guileless fellow of about 40 who nods at you politely and retreats to whatever he was tinkering with. The two men share the particular contentment of people who always have something to fix, and who find in the fixing of small things a satisfaction that other people look for in much larger ones. The lighthouse creaks and groans in every storm, and there is always a hinge to be oiled, or a shutter to be rehung, and Mr. Pennell and his nephew tend to these things with the quiet devotion of monks tending a garden. But the real entertainment is Mrs. Pennell's bedroom wall. She has, covering nearly every inch of available space, a gallery of portraits and likenesses, small paintings, tintypes, daguerreotypes, silhouettes, of her relatives, her friends, her in-laws, her neighbours, and anyone else who's ever had the misfortune of sitting for a picture within her sphere of acquaintance. She's delighted to take you through them, one by one, and her commentary is among the sharpest things you'll hear in Brimbury, or anywhere else on this coast. "That's my oldest brother's wife," she says, pointing to a stiff little portrait of a woman with an unfortunate nose. She'd be well featured enough if it weren't for that nose, which looks as if it was thrown at her from across the room, and she didn't bother catching it properly, figuring she'd get a better one later. She sets great store by her looks, though. This is delivered without a flicker of malice. Just pure, steady, affectionate observation, as precise as a knife, and just as clean. She moves to the next portrait, a cousin who married beneath her and was happier for it, then a sea captain who went bald at 30, and whose wife never forgave him, as if he'd done it on purpose. Then a neighbour's daughter who had perfect features and not a single interesting thought behind them. Each one receives a sentence or two of appraisal that is somehow both devastating and kind, and you find yourself wanting to stay in this small room forever, listening to Mrs. Purnell describe the faces of people she's known her whole life, because there is more human understanding in her casual remarks than in most books you've read. I think what I love about Mrs. Pennell is that she is entirely herself. She hasn't softened or faded or gone quiet the way so many people do when they've lived in the same small place for a long time. She reads everything she can find. She watches the sea with the attention of a scholar. She has opinions about the weather, about the neighbours' chickens, about the state of the harbour, about the new minister's sermons, and she offers them freely, without apology, in a voice that's never loud but never uncertain. She's been out here on this rock for years and years, and the isolation hasn't made her smaller. If anything, it's made her more precise, more distilled, the way sea salt is more intense than any salt you'd find inland. She's the best company in Brimbury, and she knows it, and she doesn't mind that you know it too. After supper, and Mrs. Pennell's suppers are unreasonably good, served on heavy plates in a kitchen where oil barrels line one wall, and the lamp swings gently with the swell, and the conversation never stops. You climb the iron ladder to the lantern room. Mrs. Purnell tells you to mind your head and watch your step, and then goes back to clearing the table as if sending people up a lighthouse were as ordinary as sweeping the floor. The rungs are narrow and cold under your hands, and the shaft is tight enough that your shoulders brush the walls, and you can feel the whole tower vibrating faintly, a deep low hum that comes from the sea pressing against the rocks below. And then you come up through the hatch into the glass room at the top, and everything opens out. The light hasn't been lit yet. The big lamp sits dark in the centre of its ring of lenses, and Mr. Pennell moves around it with the unhurried care of a man performing a daily ritual, trimming the wick, checking the oil, wiping the brass fittings with a cloth. He doesn't rush. He does everything in the same order, every evening, and there's a calm in the repetition that feels like prayer. And then he lights it, and the flame catches and steadies, and the lenses gather it and throw it outward in a long, slow-turning beam that reaches out across the water and into the dark. But it isn't dark yet. Not quite. This is the hour when the sky does what it does best at the edge of the sea, and from this height, not very high really, but high enough, you can see it all. Tonight the clouds are heavy and grey in the west, hanging low and solid, and the sea beneath them has gone silver, flat and still and luminous, as if the light were coming from the water itself rather than from the sky. You can look underneath the edge of the clouds and see the palest, clearest yellow stretching away toward a horizon so faint it barely exists. There's a small boat out there, black against the silver, drifting slowly, climbing one low wave and then the next as if it were making its way toward that far, still light. You watch it for a long time. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere in particular. It's just moving the way the sea moves, without hurry, without destination. And then the sun breaks through. Just for a moment, just beneath the cloud bank, and everything changes. The silver goes to gold, the water catches fire, and the little boat is no longer black but burning, and the whole world is blazing and soft and impossibly beautiful. And you can feel the day letting go, giving up its last warmth, pouring it all out across the water as if it had been saving it for this. You don't say anything. Nobody does. Mrs. Pennell has come up to stand beside you, and even she is quiet, watching the light change on the sea, with an expression that is not quite wonder and not quite sadness, but something between the two. Something that has no name, but that you recognise because you're feeling it too. This is what she sees every evening. This woman who says she never gets tired of the view, and you believe her because a sunset like this one doesn't wear out. It renews itself. It's different every time, and every time it carries the same weight. The weight of a day ending, of light going out, of one more turn of the earth bringing darkness and rest. And then the sun drops below the cloud bank and the gold drains out of the water, and the sky turns violet and then grey and then dark, and the stars begin to appear, very faintly at first, one by one, as if someone were lighting candles in a very high ceiling. The lighthouse beam swings past you, steady and slow, reaching out across the water towards ships you can't see. Later, you row back to shore. The lighthouse lamp turns steadily behind you, sweeping its beam across the dark water in long, slow passes, and the town ahead is a scattering of small yellow windows against the black shape of the hill. Nobody speaks. The oars dip and pull, and the boat rocks gently, and the stars overhead are so thick and so bright that you feel, for a moment, as if you could reach up and touch them. You turn and look back the way you came, out past the lighthouse and the reef toward the open ocean, and there is nothing there but darkness and the faint white line of breaking waves and the enormous silence of a world that has no edges. The sea is alive beneath you, breathing slowly, lifting the boat on one broad swell and setting it down on the next, and the motion is so steady and so ancient that it feels less like movement than like sleep. There is a moment out here between the lighthouse and the shore when you understand something that the captains have known all their lives and never put into words. The sea is not a place you go to. It's a place you come from. It's the thing that made this town and these people and these stories, and even now, when the harbour has silted up and the ships are gone, the sea is still here, still breathing, still holding the rocks and the lighthouse in its dark hands. Everything that happened in Brimbury, every voyage, every storm, every yard of Bristol cloth and every one-eyed cat, happened because the sea was here. And when the last captain is gone, and the last wharf has rotted into the water, the sea will still be here, and the lighthouse will still burn, and the tide will still come in. You reach the shore. The boat scrapes on the pebbles. The harbour is quiet. The autumn comes. You feel it in the mornings first, a sharpness in the air that wasn't there the week before, a coldness on the wharf planks that lingers past noon, a brightness in the light that is beautiful but has something final about it, like the last page of a book you don't want to end. The flower beds in the front yards go black with frost, though a few stubborn pansies keep blooming under the dead stalks, their small faces turned up to the cold as if they hadn't heard the news. The trees along the ridge road lose their leaves, all but the oaks, which cling to theirs and make a thin, shivering rustle in the wind that sounds like something afraid. The sea looks different now, colder, greyer, less patient, less willing to play. It moves with a heaviness that suggests it's done with summer and ready for something harder. The captains feel it. They come down to the wharf later in the morning and leave earlier in the afternoon, and they wear ancient greatcoats with enormous pockets and horn buttons, and they walk with a heavier roll than usual, as if the ground beneath them were pitching in a winter sea. The rheumatism has settled in. You can see it in the way they lower themselves onto the planks, carefully, slowly, with a tightness around the mouth that they don't explain. They don't complain. They've had worse weather in worse places, and they aren't the kind to make a fuss. But the arguments about tonnage are shorter now, and the stories come slower, and sometimes there are long stretches when nobody says anything at all, and the only sound is the wind off the harbour and the knock of a loose board on the old brig's hull. You know what comes to me, watching them in these last days. It's the thought that everything I've been listening to all summer, every story, every argument, every name and date and tonnage figure, lives only here, in these old heads, on this wharf. When these men are gone, the stories go with them. The Bristol cloth, the 9 cats in the barrel, the Italian sailor's little blue chest, Captain Waverley's midnight ride, the nun who held Jem's head on her arm. All of it will be gone, the way a tide pool goes dry when the water recedes, and nothing will be left but the rocks and the sand and the silence. That's what Captain Wardell was trying to tell me in his warehouse. We get our time in the sun, and then the world moves on. But not yet. Not quite yet. They're still here this morning, these old men with their pipes and their greatcoats and their pale, stubborn eyes. And the harbour is still here, and the lighthouse and the fish houses and the cats. And I think that's worth something. That the simply being here, right now, in this exact moment, before the winter comes, is itself a kind of treasure, no less real for being temporary. And then one morning you walk down to the shore for the last time, and the light is thin and gold and the harbour is very still. The captains are in their spots. Captain Hale nods from his end of the wharf, and his silver eyes follow you for a moment and then go back to the water. Captain Wardell lifts his pipe in a quiet salute. Down by the fish houses you find Jem in his red shirt, slivering porgies. The cats are there. The knife moves. The backbone drops into the bucket. You tell him you're going. He doesn't look up at first. His knife keeps moving. The porgy falls apart in his hands the way it always does, quick and clean. Then he does look up, and his face does something quick and complicated that he tries to smooth away, and he says in his gruff, honest voice, "Going, are you? Well, I'm sorry. You've been kind to me. God bless you." And then he is so embarrassed by having said this that he turns and walks quickly behind the nearest shed wall, and you can see his red shirt disappear, and the cats look up briefly at the sudden movement and then go back to their meal. And the harbour is quiet, and the wharf is quiet, and the lighthouse stands pale and steady on its rock against the grey autumn sky, and the light which has not yet been lit will burn again tonight, as it does every night, as it has done for longer than anyone on this wharf can remember, for whoever is out there on the water, making their way home in the dark. And so the wharf is empty now, and the day is almost done, and the old harbour sits in its last light the way it has sat for 100 years, patient, quiet, letting the tide do what it will. The captains have gone home, the fish houses are closed, the cats have slipped away to wherever cats go when the evening turns cold, and you are here, wherever you are, lying in the warmth of your own bed, and the distance between this moment and that old wharf is very great, and also, somehow, not very great at all. Because the things those men carried, the stories, the names, the smell of salt on old broadcloth, the sound of a one-eyed cat purring in the dark, those things are with you now. You've been sitting among them all this time, listening, and whether you followed every word or drifted in and out, the way the tide drifts in and out of a harbour, something of Brimbury has settled into you, the feel of sun-warmed planks, the low drone of Captain Hale's voice, the quiet inside Captain Waddell's warehouse, where a young sailor's needles are still sharp after all these years, Jem's red shirt disappearing around the corner, Mrs. Pennell's laughter, dry and bright, carrying across the water from the lighthouse. These were ordinary people. Not one of them would have called himself remarkable. They were old men on a wharf, a fisherman in a shed, a woman on a rock. They lived their lives in a small place, and they told their stories to each other, and now I've told them to you, and that's all there is. But I think there is something in ordinary lives, quietly lived, that deserves to be remembered, not celebrated, not analysed, just remembered. Held gently, the way Captain Wardle holds the things in his warehouse, kept safe, the way Jem kept the little book the nun gave him, carried forward, one voice at a time, into the dark. If any of this stayed with you tonight, a face, a name, a small moment that you'd like to turn over in your mind, I'd be glad to hear about it. You're welcome to leave a few words below whenever you like. There's no hurry. It can wait until morning, or until whenever feels right. This is what we do here, on this channel. We tell stories, slowly, quietly, one at a time. We go to places that are mostly forgotten, old harbours and medieval kitchens, ancient temples and candlelit parlours, and we sit with the people who lived there, and we listen to what they have to say. There are so many stories still waiting. Stories from the Middle Ages, from ancient Rome and Egypt, from old houses and quiet towns that the world has passed by. We'll get to them, slowly, one evening at a time. If you'd like to be here when we do, you're warmly welcome to follow the channel, so that another night like this one can find you when you need it. And if you've been here before, and you've come back, thank you. It means more than I can easily say. For now, the harbour is still. The lighthouse is burning, the tide is coming in, slow and sure, the way it always does. And wherever you are tonight, I hope the bed is warm, and the room is dark, and the quiet is the good kind. Sleep well,